Welcome back to the Friends of the Smokies podcast, Just Between Friends. I'm Dana Sowen, the president of Friends of the Smokies, and I'm so glad you joined us again for our second podcast in this series where we really want to highlight the projects and the people and the partnerships that bring the Friends of the Smokies funded projects to life in the park. And our mission here is simple: to raise funds and friends to support this park that we all love and care about so much. And I'm so excited about today's episode because we are going to highlight a project during an anniversary year, the 25th anniversary of the return of elk in Great Smoky Mountains National Park. And that's a pretty powerful thing. If you've ever been to Oconaluftee or Cataloochee and been able to experience hearing the elk during the bugling season, you know just how special the return of the elk is. Today, we've got the park's wildlife biologist, Joe Yarkovich, who's been with the program for more than 20 years, and he's going to share with us that behind-the-scenes story about what it means to be a part of what I think is one of the best conservation stories in certainly the Smokies, but really the Eastern United States. So, Joe, welcome. We're delighted to have you with us today.
Yeah. Hey, Dana, thanks for having me. And, you picked a really good time for this with it being the 25th anniversary year. Always happy to catch up with you and always happy to chat about the elk program.
Joe and I actually got to overlap our careers for a little bit, so it's great. I'd rather be standing out in the field with you today, but this will do. So I want to start with just you, Joe. So tell us a little bit about what made you decide you wanted to be a wildlife biologist.
Well, I always knew growing up I wanted to work outdoors and in the outdoor industry some way. And I really didn't know what kind of jobs were available out there or what kind of career paths I could take. And I happened to be on a backpacking trip in the Smokies my senior year of high school. And I bumped into somebody at a backcountry shelter who was working for the wildlife management team here. And as I started to talk to him about what he was doing and what his job was, I was completely blown away that people got paid to do the things that the wildlife crew here was doing. And it just sounded like so much fun. I said, I'm going to do that someday. Um, Fast forward a few years, I got kind of put a bug in the biologist ear at the time that I wanted to work here and was looking for opportunities. And they picked me up as an intern for a summer to kind of try it out. And man, I fell in love with the place right then and there. And I worked a few seasons after that, and then moved away for a while. And as fate would have it, I came back to the Smokies backpacking again and just stopped in to talk to the former supervisors there. And they asked if I was there to apply for a job that I didn't even know was advertised at the time. And, they both asked, and I said, well, I guess I'm here to apply for the job then. And so, um, put in my application, and the rest is history. I've been here for the last 20 years since then.
So the elk had already been reintroduced by the time you started.
They had my first internship was in 2001, which was the year that the elk hit the ground. And so it was all very fresh, very new. My involvement with them was really minimal, though. I only got over to see them once or twice. I was working more with bears on the Tennessee side of the park. I really didn't get my feet wet on the elk program until I came back in 2006.
So I was fortunate enough to be there the day the elk were released. I had a 1-year-old son and a 2-year-old or 2.5-year-old son with me. So I was wrestling kids, but I won't never forget the excitement when they opened the chute and the elk ran out. And
Yeah,
I
I
hope
wish
you've seen video of that.
it looked like quite an event, and man, that would have been fun to be there and watch them hit the ground.
So elk were gone from the Smokies for, I guess, more than a century. And how did they disappear?
So elk were native and abundant in all of North America, really, prior to the arrival of Europeans to the continent. Um, as settlement increased and populations expanded, pushed westward into new areas, those settlers brought with them a lot of destructive practices like overhunting, destruction of habitat, and these elk were also competing with domestic livestock that the settlers depended on, such as cattle. And so really they were seen as a threat, but the bigger issue was the overhunting and the sport harvest, as well as the meat and leather industry harvest of these animals. Um, because of the combination of those things, elk were eliminated from most of the East Coast by the late 1700s, early 1800s. In North Carolina, it was late 1790s, they believe the last elk was shot and killed from the state. So going from that, nearly 200 years forward till the elk hit the ground in the Smokies, the area really went through a whole lot of changes since then.
So, any idea how many elk might have once roamed through what is considered the Smokies?
If you look at historical records, there's not a lot of science behind any of the claims. Like most things, when the continent was being settled and explored, the knowledge that we have in Western culture is from written histories, or a lot of times it's just the journals of the explorers at the time. And so they weren't putting down numbers. They weren't talking about population densities or population structures or anything like that. They might note just a side note in a journal, killed 2 elk today, something like along those lines. And so those records are how we know the animals were here. They're just noted as being present in some of the areas. And elk antlers have been found in some areas in Western North Carolina that, were historic and were found long ago. Uh, so we know they were here, but we don't know much about their densities or really what the population looked like. They would have been utilizing a lot of woodlands, probably more so than they do today. And it was actually a subspecies of elk known as the eastern elk subspecies that was driven to extinction during those times. So the elk that we have today is the closest living relative to the eastern elk. We have Manitoban elk in the park today. And as far as if you were to put one beside the other to look at, you probably wouldn't be able to tell the difference. There's just some genetic level differences between the two.
So, it's fascinating to me that people, probably wildlife biologists and conservationists, had this idea what it could be to try to return elk. And I'm just curious what that story is that from the people who had this vision and how they brought that idea to reality. So, a little before your time, but I'm sure you worked with some of these people who brought this idea to life.
Yeah, I sure have, and I owe my career to some of the people that brought these animals back to the park. Um, Kind of the origin story or the impetus to get them back into the park actually started with the Rocky Mountain Elk Foundation approaching the park in the 1990s and saying, "What do you think about bringing elk back to the area?" Um, at the time, the park was involved with a couple other reintroduction projects and couldn't take it on full steam right away, but it definitely piqued our interest, and it falls within the National Park Service's mission statement of restoring extirpated species whenever it's possible. So if an animal was there and it was wiped out due to human causes, it falls within the Park Service's mission to restore that animal if you can. Um, so that really got the balls rolling, and we knew it wouldn't be a quick process. There were a lot of steps along the way that needed to happen. And so those steps really began in the 1990s, looking at habitat assessments. As much as the area had changed in 200 years, was there still food available for the animals? Was there enough space for the animals? What kind of diseases or parasites might impact the animals? All those things needed to be considered before elk could be brought in and put onto the landscape. So the Elk Foundation approached the park in the 90s. That got the ball rolling, where the park started all these different assessments and analyses to see if elk could be supported here again. And really, the driver behind it at the time was the supervisory biologist Kim Delosier, and he picked up on the idea, made it one of his missions that this was something the park was going to try out, as long as we had the backing and it wasn't putting any undue risk on surrounding communities or livestock. Um, that he was going to try to get elk reintroduced back into the park. So fast forward several years from that, after a PhD student did a habitat analysis and a disease risk assessment and environmental assessment, which was really the last step before getting the elk here, was the environmental impact statement. As part of that, there's a 30-day public comment period where anybody from the public can weigh in as to whether they think this is a good idea or if they have any major concerns about the project or suggestions for the project. During that 30-day public comment period, 3 people wrote in and said, it's a bad idea, don't bring elk back. I think 7 or so people wrote in and said, I can see both sides of it. It wasn't really categorized as positive or negative. And over 2,400 people wrote in and said, it's a great idea, go for it. So, right off the bat, there was a large showing of public support for the project.
What a testament to community support. And I remember seeing photographs of some of those public meetings that filled gyms in Western North Carolina, people that came out to voice their support. And that's what it really took for partners and community support. And of course, Friends was one of those partners, but who else were some of those integral partners?
Yeah, 100%. Friends was one of the biggest partners for the project right off the bat. Alongside Rocky Mountain Elk Foundation, University of Tennessee put a lot into it because it was really research heavy on the front end. Those are the biggest contributors for the first, 10 years of the project or so, at least.
And certainly, I guess, the state agencies, like
State
North
agencies,
Carolina.
we had support from North Carolina Wildlife Resource Commission, Tennessee Wildlife Resource Agency, National Wildlife Federation, the North Carolina Wildlife Federation. There were a lot of local entities that were on board for the project.
That's years of research and bringing people together before the day that I got to experience that the elk were released. So I think that's remarkable to hear that background. And then after the elk were released, you would have been here. What were some of those early challenges?
One of the biggest factors was just having a smaller group of animals than what we had wanted to start out with. The original plan was to bring in 75 to 90 animals across a 3-year period. Because of some different state regulations, we ended up with 52 animals rather than the 75 to 90 that we had wanted. So that group started small, and it started heavy on the males, which if you want to grow a population, you really don't need a lot of males in the population. You want more females because they're the ones producing the calves. So kind of 2 factors going against it that led to this really slow growth the first couple of years. The other thing that we were seeing with that was the elk were reproducing and having really healthy calves, but the bears were just scooping those calves up like candy. And it's because the elks that were brought in had never seen a black bear before. They didn't know how to hide their calves from them. They didn't know how to defend their calves against them. It really took them, 5 to 8 or 9 years to figure out where to have their calves safely, how to fight back against bears and fend the bears off, or even to realize that bears were a big predator and a big threat at the time. So once they figured that out, we saw the population growth really tick up and start to grow a little bit faster and more stable.
Wow. So we've supported monitoring, the friends and our donors have supported monitoring the population throughout the 25-year history for the health of the herd. But I really don't know how you do that monitoring and what are some of the things you learn that help us then protect the elk.
Yeah, we use the equipment we use to monitor the elk has evolved over the years as well. So initially, a lot of the stuff we were using, we tried GPS-based radio collars. We tried and just land-based VHF radio collars on these animals. We've gone through a couple iterations of all of that, and I'll say that large portion of that has been funded entirely by Friends of the Smokies. So when we get into these different equipments and trying out different technologies, most of the time, and even up through today, we're coming to Friends of the Smokies as a partner on this, and they're providing support for these collars and all the equipment that we use on the animals. So we've tried a couple different iterations. What we landed on and what we use now are mostly VHS or VHF based radio collars. which require somebody to go out on the landscape and manually track them down. Satellite collars are great, but they're very expensive. And for what we're doing, we don't need that. Really, what we're looking at with the radio collars now is survival of the animals, reproduction of the animals, dispersal into new areas, all the parameters that we can gather from that, such as calf survival, adult mortality, causes of mortality. Being able to track that animal allows us to find it quickly when there is a mortality event and figure out why that animal died. Um, so the things that we look at now are herd health. Are we seeing any new diseases pop up in the herd? Which, knock on wood, we're not. Um, we're looking at reproduction and calf survival because that's really the biggest driver determining how quickly the population grows is calf survival. We're looking at adult female survival, another huge aspect of population modeling. And so all of these little sciencey things that we do, the bottom line of that is the herd healthy, and is it continuing to grow, or has it stabilized, and are they pioneering into new areas? Since they've been here, they've spread from Cataloochee to the Oconaluftee area to the point that now Oconaluftee holds more animals than Cataloochee. And, we knew they had moved over there, and we've been able to track them and follow that growth and kind of model all that out and know that elk are, essentially a permanent fixture on the landscape here now because they have healthy population growth rates. And all of that is through those radio collars that you see on some of the animals out there today.
Any surprising things you've learned?
Watching the animals' behavior has been amazing. And I always give one example of cow number 15. She was one of the original elk brought in from land between the lakes. When she was released, her first year there, she had a calf in the fields of Cataloochee, and it got killed by a bear. The next year, she had a calf just inside the woodline in Cataloochee, and it got killed by a bear. So her third year, she walked 6 miles out of Cataloochee to the Balsam Mountain area, had her calf there, it survived. She brought it back to Cataloochee once it was old enough. And every year after that, she went back to that same place to have her calves, and her calves did the same thing. And so watching that learned behavior where they're really feeling out the landscape over the years and adapting what they do has been one of the most interesting things for me, I think, was seeing how quickly they can learn and how they can adapt to new situations.
Balsam Mountain's one of my favorite places in the park, so she's made a great
Especially in the
choice.
summertime. Yeah, it stays cooler than just about everywhere else.
Well, speaking of dispersal, the talk this year, I live on the Tennessee side of the park, and the talk has been about surprising places that we've seen elk this year, in places like Townsend and the Townsend Y, and even in the community of Townsend. And as I recall, Joe, while I still worked for the park, that happened 4 or 5 years ago. So tell us more about that.
It did. As the herd has continued to grow, we've seen these animals kind of pioneer into new areas, both inside and outside of the park. And like you mentioned, it was probably 5 years ago now. We had a few young males. Young males are typically the ones that disperse and pioneer into new areas. They left Oconaluftee, went over the mountain to Gatlinburg, turned left and went out through the Townsend area. Spent a short time out there, never made it as far as Cades Cove. They made it into the Townsend area. Spent a short time there and then came back over the mountain to North Carolina closer to breeding season. And we know that again because they were radio collared, we were able to keep up with their movements. That was the last animal on the Tennessee side of the park until this year, when we had a group of about 6 animals go up to Kuohi. And a few of those animals stayed put for a while. A few of them dropped back down to Oconaluftee, and 2 of them, about 3 of them originally, dropped down on the Tennessee side towards Gatlinburg and Sugarlands area, hung out there for a little bit. 1 of those came back to North Carolina, and 2 of them kept going out toward Townsend. What I found really interesting about that is it had been probably 5 years since any other elk had walked through there. And the two females from this year walked almost the exact same path that those bulls did 5 years prior. So who knows if it's because they were still able to pick up on, some kind of elk sign that they knew other elk had been there before, or when an elk walks down a hill, if they just know this is the obvious place to walk and this is the direction we're going to go. Um, but either way, it's been kind of fun to watch those two females. They're still out around Townsend right now as of time of recording here. Um, I suspect towards breeding season, they're going to get a little antsy and head back towards O'Connell Lefty as well. But time will tell. We have one of those animals radio collared now, and we've been able to keep up with their movements for the last month or so.
I remember the 5 years ago when they were in the headquarters lawn, and we got to watch them out our windows for a few days before they headed on to Townsend. And it was all the excitement at the time.
I was going to say it generates a lot of excitement when they get to these new areas. We've had elk in the park for 25 years now, and it's really just a stone's throw from Townsend area. But as soon as an elk walked into Townsend, man, my phone and email blew up with people telling me about these things out there. So anytime they go somewhere new, it kind of regenerates that high level of excitement among people.
So you're in Townsend today. Have you seen them?
I've not seen them out here today, no.
Okay, well, I think that it's just fascinating to imagine how they might grow as a population. And so, I mean, there's no fence around the park, so they can move freely inside, outside. What's that been like with communities and helping people understand how to live with elk and, without hurting the elk and without having too much damage that they may cause to your gardens, I guess?
Yeah, there were some very real growing pains in the early years of the project when elk were new to the landscape. Nobody knew how to live with them, in private communities outside of the park. And originally, any elk in those areas was darted and brought back inside park boundaries. Uh, as time has gone on, North Carolina as a state agency has gotten more on board with elk monitoring and elk management, and now, support elk throughout North Carolina, throughout Western North Carolina. But in the early days, yeah, we had some wayward elk that got out into people's gardens, got out into people's yards, caused quite a bit of commotion. Um, we had a lot of positive responses to that, and a lot of people just calling because they were excited about it. But by the same token, we had some farmers and some landowners that were not so happy about it. And so it was a learning curve for them on learning how to better elk proof their properties, and also a learning curve for us in learning how to help people out with those issues when they have them. And so now any kind of elk issues outside of park boundaries falls to the North Carolina Wildlife Resource Commission, whereas anything within the park falls to Park Service staff.
Well, anything that you are thinking you'd like to learn through monitoring now?
I would love to have a crystal ball to see what things look like 20 years, 50 years from now. Seeing the population dynamics and the way the herd has changed in both where they are and how they behave, and what areas they kind of pioneer into. I would love to have a snapshot of that. But the only way to really know is to just keep up the research that we're doing now. And, the initial years of the project were really research intensive. We tried to radio collar every animal that was out there. We've scaled way back on that in recent years. And the level that we're at now is kind of a maintenance phase where we're just continuing to gather the data. We're just running the programs that were originally set up. And it's at a level that's manageable for the next, 20, 25 years and forward. And so we'll get those answers. I just need to wait a few years on them.
Well, Joe, you spend a lot of time out west, I'm sure. And what's the difference, or is there a difference between like herd behavior in the rut season from the elk, maybe in the Rockies, to here in the Smokies experience?
Actual animal behavior, there's not much difference between our elk here and what you see out west. If you're really an elk nut, you're going to see that our body weights tend to be higher. We tend to have bigger elk than a lot of places out west. And that's because there's such abundant food resources for them here. when you go through the different seasons of the year, the behaviors are basically the same. The most exciting time for most people to see elk is going to be the fall, during the fall rut, when breeding season comes around and the bulls are bugling and fighting with other bulls and chasing the cows around. The calves from the springtime are old enough to be up and running around playing, and it's a really exciting time for people to see elk. Where I think the difference is, and what sets us aside, is the availability of viewing the elk here and the proximity to those animals. Uh, where you go in Cataloochee or Econolofty, you're right there in the action. You're not watching elk on some far off hillside that you can barely see. You know, you can sit in your car and you are front seat to the bulls fighting each other and bugling and chasing the cows around, and you're right in the action. And so, really, that's what sets the Smokies aside for an elk viewing destination, is the proximity to these animals. And with the fall foliage coming around that time of year, man, it's a special time to go and see the wildlife in the park.
Well, that also presents some challenges because they are so accessible. So what should our visitors do to safely view elk for themselves and the elk?
Yeah, great question. If you're looking for information on where to see the elk at any given time, or um, any particular safety issues or any current issues going on, pop in at the visitor center and talk to them at O'Connell Lufty. They're going to know. But basic safe viewing practices are what come to mind. And so we get a lot of traffic. We get a lot of people that are excited to see these animals and sometimes forget themselves, get caught up in the excitement. We have a 25-yard rule for elk. So you are not allowed to be within 25 yards of any animal. And that means you can't approach it within 25 yards, or if it walks towards you, you are now required to back up and give that animal 25 yards. That's the biggest thing that people can do for their own safety as well as the safety of the animal, is to stay that minimum distance or farther away. If you're here during one of the really popular times like the fall rut, we ask people to stay in or near their vehicle because these animals can be really unpredictable. A lot of the times they're out there and they look so docile and they look so calm. But at the drop of a hat, that can all change, particularly during the rut when the bulls are really fired up and agitated and full of testosterone and looking for a fight. Uh, they'll fight anything that they see as a challenge, and you certainly don't want to have yourself too close to that animal when it happens. So if you're able to view elk from the roadside, we ask that you safely pull all four wheels off the road so you're not obstructing traffic. Remain in or near your vehicle, and pay really close attention to the volunteers that are there helping out. We have dedicated staff during popular elk viewing times just to help visitors experience the animals and do it in a way that's safe for both them and the animals.
Well, it seems like when I've been viewing them now in a Econolofty over the last couple of weeks, that there's large groups of females. I haven't seen as many males. So did they stay separated through a lot of the year and until fall comes?
They do, and that's part of what makes the fall such a good time to view the elk, is that through most of the year, the females will form these maternity groups where it's mostly all adult females raising their young, and they'll kind of congregate into larger herds of just females during that time of year, or subadults. And the mature bulls will go off by themselves for most of the year. And the biological reason for that is they don't have to share resources. So any food that's around is entirely their food. They can eat all the best foods. That enables them to put on more weight faster and enables them to grow bigger antlers. They have better nutrition that way. So, from a biological standpoint, it's advantageous to them to spend the year by themselves and then get together during the rut when it's time to actually breed. So right now, most of the larger mature bulls are off in isolated pockets by themselves. Within the next couple of weeks here, they're going to be shedding the velvet from the antlers. Their testosterone levels are really going to spike. And typically by the first week in September, we start to see those big bulls moving back into Cataloochee, moving back into Econolofty, and becoming a lot more visible. So if you want to see the big bulls that are out there, September, October, even into November are probably the best times to be there and see them.
All right. Is that one of your favorite times to view elk, or?
It's a bittersweet time to view the elk, I guess, because it's a great show they put on, and I love to see the big bulls as well, but it comes with an increase in traffic, and it comes with an increase in visitation, and really keeps us on our toes in terms of trying to manage that visitor experience safely. Um, so I always point to calving season as my favorite time of the year,
New
when the
life.
newborns hit the ground in the spring, mostly through the month of June. That's really what determines the future of the herd. And that's really biologically the important thing that's out there, the newborns. And so, it's a lot more fun for me. Things are quieter. We get to see newborn baby elk out there and get our hands on some of those, the radio collar and trap survival. Um, so I enjoy it all, but springtime is probably my favorite.
I think I'll end then with this question, Joe, and that's, I'm assuming this has been a very rewarding part of your career, but what's made it special for you to be a part of this?
I really like the Smokies in general. I had mentioned earlier that the first time I came here backpacking, I fell in love with the place. And, I'm still in love with the park here. It's just such a great landscape. Work with a bunch of great people. We have a really good crew. And to be honest, my job is still fun. I started doing a job 20 plus years ago because I thought it was fun and I enjoyed it. And I can still say that today. So, I've got probably another 10 years or so in me, and I plan on spending those 10 right here in the Smokies.
Well, if that's a good thing for the Smokies, it's a good thing for elk, and we appreciate your time with us today, Joe. And for all of you, you've been a part of our friends family. You've been a part of this story too. Whether you've made a gift of $5 or $500, or you have one of our Friends of the Smokies license plates, these are all funds that have been providing now more than $300,000 to support this program. And I suspect we'll see it on the needs list for 2027 to help support Joe's program. And we are delighted to continue to be a part of the success of the elk program. So thank you to all our listeners. I hope you'll join us again next month for our podcast, Just Between Friends, where we take you behind the scenes to learn about the programs and the projects and partners that bring life to some of these incredible visions in protection of the Smokies. I'm Dana Sowen, and again, I thank you for being a friend.